Professor of Social Anthropology at Cambridge and director of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. And until recently, she was director of the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, and was hugely influential in lots of our thinking about what we're hearing today about West Africa. And I'm fascinated to hear what's going on, but more generally about how we should view the natural world and human relationships to the natural world as well. So, and we've had a fascinating afternoon of conversations, and I look forward to hearing more.
Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here amongst old friends and new, and to be talking about things that I've been working on for quite a long time in different ways, but maybe have some new resonance in the context of our current mutual preoccupation with nature recovery and with futures. So I'm going to talk today about forests. I've always done a lot of, no, this is not working. Hang on. Sorry, I've stopped. Why is that not going now? Ah, yes, it does. I've always worked a great deal on forests, and I find forests both good to think with and actually pretty important. And I think forests and the people who live in them and with them are under the global scientific and policy and popular spotlight, perhaps as never before. We see forest-human interactions often framed as human disturbance of natural forest, blamed often for climate change, for biodiversity loss, for related sort of planetary predicaments. But they're also celebrated, of course, for contributing to the solutions, fixing carbon, sustaining water, sustaining life, as long as they're well stewarded. And we also see, very fundamentally, the centrality now of local communities and claims about Indigenous people and their importance to such stewardship. And this is being recognised, whether in long-standing schemes and advocacy for community forest management, for community engagement in forest protection and enhancement, as well as in the claims and movements of forest communities, Indigenous peoples, perhaps gaining greater global recognition, as they did, for instance, at the last Biodiversity COP in Cali, in Colombia. And I think we see this centrality of local stewardship too in the critique of fortress-type forest conservation and preservation schemes that actually exclude those very communities and dispossess them of rights, becoming what colleagues and I more than a decade ago now coined as green grabbing, a new form of appropriation of nature for environmental ends, and analysed then in 2012 with a focus on carbon schemes and REDD+ in African settings, something that is now absolutely to the fore in many current debates. And as our report with IPES Food, the International Panel of Experts, which is something I'm part of on food system sustainability, argued last year, and in some policy briefs that we then took to the Biodiversity COP, the proliferation of nature finance schemes, carbon markets, and big area-based conservation, now often to meet 30 by 30 targets, can be seen as part of a new generation of green grabs, which are often squeezing land access and control and use, especially by smallholders and sometimes by local and Indigenous groups. So that kind of big backdrop really leads one to need to ask always, whose forests are we talking about? Whose goals? Whose livelihoods? And this is indeed where we often come to forest livelihoods. And I think livelihoods and the recognition of their significance and support for them in research and policy and interventions, and in big global movements like the FLAIR conferences, where I gave a version of this talk last autumn, are super important. And livelihoods approaches, and this is just one version, this is the framework that came out of my group at IDS in the late 90s and came to drive DFID's approaches to rural programming over quite a long time, are relevant in relation to forests. They'd highlight the multiple benefits that people get, the importance of a huge variety of forest resources and services for individuals, for households, for communities, the capitals involved, and how people combine them in complex ways to survive or to thrive, and the governance contexts and arrangements at multi-layers that are involved in that. And I think livelihoods perspectives interlink too with important calls for equity and justice in forest management, and indeed in just transitions arguments in sustainability more broadly. So we can ask, as my Future Earth group did a number of years ago, and in the paper referenced here, equity of what and between whom? We can pull out different dimensions. We can look at their intersections, and some of those are in the middle of this diagram. And around the edge, we can build on Nancy Fraser's original conception to think about distributional justice and equity, who gets what. Procedural, how are decisions made about these things, with an emphasis perhaps particularly on participation in decision-making, including of less heard groups. And we can think also about what Fraser termed recognitional equity or justice, to ask who and what are included and who are excluded. We could also think about combining those, perhaps to think about a forest scheme and how it's working, as in this image, which comes from the Western Area Forest in Sierra Leone, where there are multiple goals and values around how this forest might be used and by whom. Requiring equitable deliberation. So have I got something going on the screen there? Yeah, how can I get rid of that? Requiring equity in procedures to think about how those different goals and values come to have weight in decision-making about forest futures, and how that in turn leads into distributional equity or otherwise. And I think across the world now, there are many examples trying to apply best practice in thinking about equity and justice, including some of those that are applied by the partners, the conservation organisations I now work with in the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. But what I want to ask in this talk is whether this goes far enough. And I'm going to suggest that appreciation of forest livelihoods and the dimensions of justice and equity that flow from those are necessary but insufficient. And I want to suggest that we need greater understanding and recognition and support for what I'm going to term forest lifeways, and to suggest that livelihoods, which perhaps foreground the socioeconomic dimensions of people-forest relations and perhaps short-term aspects of equity, are part of this, but they can't be all. So what I want to suggest is that a Lifeways perspective, and I'm going to lay out a bit about what that means, offers two major additions. And the first is to see how livelihoods are always embedded within broader worldviews, or what one might call life worlds, of people who live in and with forests. Grounded in everyday experiences, sometimes elaborated in philosophies and cosmologies, something we might identify as indigenous philosophies and cosmologies. And to recognize that these ways of knowing, ways of being, don't necessarily follow the nature-culture boundaries that post-Enlightenment science, as it's developed particularly in Europe and America, would have us believe, but rather they place people as part of nature, in what I've come to term nature kind, a kind of coming together of the human and the non-human in common worlds, within more than human relations and assemblages that include people, but they also include plants, animals, insects, earths, often rocks, water, spiritual beings of varying kinds. And there are a lot of examples which come both from work with and on indigenous ways of thinking that highlight those. In African context, for instance, the Cameroonian anthropologist Francis Nyamjo explores what he calls the conviviality of humans and the more than human world. Or in Southern Africa, Etiembo uses the term Ubuntu from Bantu languages to describe, to quote, the ways in which all beings, including humans, gods, spirits, animals, and inanimate beings, belong together in a community of beings. So where's nature and culture in that? Where's the human and the non-human? The boundaries begin to dissolve and are something quite different. Now, there are, of course, innumerable versions of these more than human worlds in what we might understand as a pluriverse of worlds on a shared planet. cultural diversity that certainly extends across local communities and indigenous peoples, but also I would suggest into everybody's everyday experiences, although sometimes occluded by our formal education and science. We're all a pluriverse. We all have multiple ways of thinking and being, and those that we choose to enact in a seminar or in a biology department aren't necessarily the same as those that emerge when, I don't know, we're with our companion animals, or we're in our gardens, or we're walking in nature. I'll come back to that in a minute, but this is every day as well as out there in Indigenous worlds. But the second edition is to appreciate life worlds, worldviews as embedded in space and in time. The interconnections between beings are sometimes inscribed in place in the landscape through specific vegetation types maybe, or sacred places and sacred trees and so on. And as historical ecologists have long recognized past events and cultural repertoires and relations between people and landscapes, whether linked to events of climates, of pandemics, of building, of infrastructure, and indeed interventions like forest protection schemes, leave their mark. They leave legacies which subsequent interactions build on. So we might come to understand pathways of change, often visibilized in landscapes, whereby you have interactions, you have responses, and they build into the future. And the impact of those particular events and pathways often become imprinted in landscapes themselves, layer upon layer, so that the forest landscape becomes almost a kind of living archive of what's gone before. And what's important too is that the people, and perhaps the non-humans, that's a question, often come to memorialize and safeguard what we might think of as kind of socio-natural heritage in this way. And it becomes part of their claims to place, to territory, and the social and political statuses that often go along with that. And crucially, what's gone before often conditions how people live in the present and what they might imagine of the future, what's desirable or what's dangerous, what's imaginable or unimaginable, hoped for or feared. So this is what I mean. These sort of double elements are what I mean by Lifeways. Livelihoods are part of it, but they're not all. Historical life worlds embedded in historical ecologies that run from the past and, if appreciated or enabled, might shape the future. They might become part of what I think in this group you'd call nature recovery. So what I want to do now is turn to some stories from different parts of the pluriverse, which show that viewed through a Lifeways lens, forests are not always what we might immediately assume them to be. Okay, so that's the thrust of these stories. These are stories that are going to challenge the assumption of natural forest disturbance by people. And they also challenge the assumption that securing livelihoods is enough to include people and, as it were, build better human-nature relationships. And as I'll come to at the end, they also challenge that tripartite framework from Fraser for thinking about equity and justice in relation to conservation or restoration or nature repair and recovery. And the stories I'm going to tell emerge from ethnographic work. So I'm an anthropologist. The way I tend to work is through participant observation, listening, informal conversations and interactions with everyday experiences. But the first come from my own work in West Africa with my colleague and life partner, James Fairhead, with some other colleagues, James Fairhead, Kojo Amanor in Ghana, Dominique Milamuno, but critically with the Kissi, Koranko and Mende people who were our hosts, who we lived and worked among. And then I'm going to turn more briefly to some cases from North America, drawing on others' work, and then from southern UK, which is a kind of auto-ethnography of some of the things I live in, the landscapes that I call home when I'm in the UK. So to begin with West Africa, and a region that I know is of interest to a number of people in this room, and we've just been talking about it. This is the tri-border zone, as it's often known, between Guinea and Liberia and Sierra Leone, up in this part here, which is my focus. A super hot biodiversity hotspot, the focus of some big conservation schemes and concern, and over the last decade, a target for carbon schemes and nature-based solutions to climate change as well. And forest here, as in the labeling of this map, is usually portrayed as highly degraded from its original extent. A set of assumptions about forest history that the stories I'm about to tell find quite major cause to question. So we can start on the Guinea-Liberia border, so sort of just in this bit, the southern bit of Guinea, in the forest of Ziama. And it's part of, these days, some quite major transboundary forest reserve plans. And there's an impressive high forest here. It's dense semi-deciduous forest, has important populations of rare but endemic birds, reptiles, forest elephants. And it's under current pressure, especially for conversion to commercial agriculture, to extractive mining, in a region that's been deeply impoverished over decades by extractive mining and by economic decline. And a number of NGOs, including Fauna and Flora, which co-occupy the building I work with at CCI in Cambridge, are working with local groups, the Centre Forestier des Zérekouré in the south of Guinea, to engage Loma communities who live in small villages these days around the forest in forest protection, including in providing alternative livelihoods to try and reduce the pressure of smallholder farming in the buffer zone so that people don't kind of degrade and push into this forest further. And the project communication, as in this picture up here on the right, typically presents this as a pristine forest coming under recent pressure, as if for the first time. But this happens to be a forest amongst many whose history is particularly well recorded, not just in the oral traditions of elders, of Loma elders who live now in the village, the small villages around the reserve, like these groups in Bo who we visited, but also uniquely in a set of travel accounts from 3 Americo-Liberians who walked up from the coast in the middle of the 19th century, and whose accounts describe not high forest at all when they reach this region, but large wealthy settlements of up to 5,000 people on trans-African trade routes of gold, of slaves, of palm kernels, and these towns were not in the middle of forests, they were in wall-to-wall rice fields, feeding those populations. And what happened was that with the late 19th century wars associated with colonial occupation, this region, like many others actually across the West African forest zone, suffered massive economic devastation, certain amount of epidemic disease, and population decline. And as people left, forest regrew. It grew anyway, possibly for the first time, over farms and settlements. So that by the 1930s, when French colonial foresters like Aubreville sought to reserve Ziama as part of what was envisaged by the French colonists as a curtain of forest reserves to stop what they then feared as a kind of southern creep of the deserts from the Sahara southwards, it was a substantial forest and could be reserved as part of that curtain. And by the time what we might see as modern conservation began from the 1970s, when Ziama was first declared a biosphere reserve by UNESCO, it was respectable high forest, replete with animal populations, and very easy to treat as if it had always been there, as if it was primary forest. Yet the villagers now living in the buffer zone here, villagers like these in Bo, haven't forgotten. And when we took the accounts of these Americo-Liberian explorers to them in the early 1990s, which we did as part of a book project to annotate and resurface those accounts, they were fascinated. And the discussions we had stimulated the retelling of stories which had been passed down of decline, as well as discussions of the many, many markers of that earlier settlement, of the earlier kind of more than human cohabitation, that was still there, but now covered with high forest. So the remains of mud walls from houses in nearby Palika in Liberia, uniquely stone walls. The rings of cotton trees, Ciba pentandra, linking to ancestors. The cola-nitida trees, which link to the living, as mothers would plant the umbilical cords of their newly born children, thereby linking the tree to the person the baby would become. Places used as seclusion for grave sites and cultural initiations. All of those left legacies in the landscape. And all of those were remembered, linked also to the ever-present metaphysical power, Sale in Loma language, which is a feature for people of ancestors, of trees, and of ritual objects. And families retained connections to those sites, yet had been excluded, and by this stage for quite a long time, since the 30s, by forest reservation. And in the 1990s, as militarized conservation stepped up, particularly in a European-supported program called Projet Fort, the kind of conflict came to a head. And Projet Fort actually became locally known as Projet Mort, which translates in French as dead project, because of this kind of statement. So this is an elder in one of the forest edge villages who essentially said, give us back control over this forest and we'll look after it. It's a kind of paraphrasing of what was said there. It was a claim to control that was about far more than livelihoods. It was a claim based on historical legacies, status, and previous kind of inhabitation in a more than human, power-imbued world. And tensions simmer to today, although they're very often obscured by the very upbeat conservation project discourse of Fauna and Flora and others, which is about community engagement, alternative livelihoods, benefit sharing, and quite well-intentioned and sensitive, but I think ultimately probably quite futile efforts to explain carbon markets and how these will be of enormous benefit as a new form of funding in these forests. So that's kind of this Yama story. So that forest landscapes are archives of layered histories and more than human relations is also echoed if we move just across the border into Sierra Leone. So here we're now in the Gola Forest, which is a place where I did my PhD research, like a really long time ago in the late 80s, as a naive PhD student, working with women and with men to learn about gender relations in the use of forest resources, fishing resources, hunting resources, at a time when this forest was starting to attract interest from the Conservation Society of Sierra Leone and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, who did a lot of biodiversity surveys at that time, established a project, a collaborative project, which always tried to involve communities. That turned in 2010 into a national park, co-managed through a partnership arrangement between government, paramount chiefs who are supposed to represent their communities, the Conservation Society of Sierra Leone, and an external organization, RSPB, who now work out of the building I kind of work in Cambridge. And in 2012, it became the first forest carbon scheme, the first REDD+ scheme in West Africa. And yet, again, there are less told stories. And so this is presented now as best practice conservation with development, with community engagement and carbon funding. And villages like this is Medina, where I did my PhD, are part of this program. And they will sometimes talk in quite an upbeat, positive way about it. And they're getting some school fees paid and some new court barriers developed, which the people will paint the animals that they know to be in the forest about it. But again, there are some less told stories which emerge at other times. So elders would relate when I was living there in the late 80s and still do now, driving previous inhabitants of what is now this big Gola Forest Reserve back behind the river, as they call it, behind the water in the late 19th century, with forest again growing over abandoned settlements, similar to the Ziama case. There are the stories of traditional hunters, the Kamajo, people like Safa here, with whom I used to walk in the forest, learning about the spirits and the metaphysical power the Hale, whose ways of knowing and relating with animals and killing with respect, as he did, contrasted with what he would call those young men with guns who just go out and shoot monkeys for money. So a real difference between social status and linking with a more than human world, and a more economistic way of valuing forests. Forest protection and the outlawing of shotguns, which happened after Sierra Leone's civil war, is not just a loss of livelihood for people like Safa, but it's also a loss of status, something that he's recaptured in a very different way in becoming now the town imam. There are stories also told by the women whose fishing has always depended on navigating and negotiating with the water beings, who are also part of the streams where they take their nets to fish in the afternoons, and for whom the power which they invoke for successful fishing is deeply enwrapped with the Sunday Society, the Women's Cultural Initiation Society, whose black masks symbolize and help to invoke the fertility both of people and of the plant and animal and fish world, on whom their lives really deeply depend. So that's just a kind of taste of these sort of more than human relations. But it does suggest that when today's community members, as they often do, say to project developers, "What has Gola ever done for us?" they seem to allude to this slightly more embedded way of relating, and that's in place sense of ownership and belonging, which in local view can't really be compensated by these benefit sharing arrangements, which are coming from forest carbon schemes. A broader sense of justice, perhaps, and of belonging and status seems to be at stake. We can move further north too, to the typical, we're now in Guinea, and to a slightly different ecological zone. So less the high forest and now into the forest savanna transition zone, which again pans out across West Africa, including to some of the places in Ghana where I know there are many of you who are working. And here, the much of the landscape, certainly in Guinea, is composed of peri-village forest islands in a kind of sea of savanna grassland. And this is the book cover here is a satellite image where the red is the forest around villages, the blue is the savanna in between. And external scientists and policymakers as far back as the 1890s have repeatedly assumed these islands to be the last relics of the intact forest cover that once they assumed covered the region, but which has now been destroyed by shift in cultivation, by fire setting, by unruly timber felling, all within the last couple of decades. A continuously updated story and, in fact, myth of a landscape half empty and emptying fast of forest. It was most recently updated in 2014 in the context of the West African Ebola outbreak, which where patient zero was supposedly, probably was actually, in the village of Meliandu, just in that border zone. And the major explanation that was given, and I think is extant to today, is the idea that rapid and recent deforestation supposedly brought people and virus-hosting bats who were in the forest into contact for the first time. And this is the kind of quote that emerged from the analysis at that point. Again, this idea that you had an intact forest which has recently and rapidly been deforested, and in this case, the result was human bat contact and a zoonotic epidemic. But that's a narrative that, again, turns out to be pretty poorly supported by historical evidence. This pair of aerial photographs looks back at that 40-year period that was being talked about in that quote at the village of Meliandu, and shows that there actually hasn't been any major vegetation change over that period. The picture between 2014 and the 1980 aerial photographs, despite the slightly poor quality, shows a very, very similar picture of a forest island around a village in Savannah. So what you're getting in that narrative, in this case about an epidemic, is an obscuring both of a rather different history of people living with forests and indeed their bats, and local origin stories for Ebola, which actually focus on something quite different and would attribute it to human-human transmission. In a place where human-bat interactions and more than human conviviality between people and bats has long been taken for granted. So the kind of debunking of the forest islands as the last relics narrative has been something that my research group has been at for quite some time. I mean, we had felt the need to begin to do that back in the 90s, and again in the context of those re-narrativizing in the context of the Ebola epidemic. And what happens is that ethnographic and historical work again reveals this as a landscape not half empty and emptying of forest, but actually already half full and filling with forest. And settlement histories in Kisi and Koranko villages relate how ancestors settled in savanna and how woody vegetation began to form around settlements through a mix of intentional and unintentional practices. In the 19th century, it was often around building fortifications, which people would do by training some Ceiba pentandra cotton trees to grow up as lookout posts across the savanna, and encouraging others to grow into their branching four-armed bolonani form, as people would put it, to provide the structure for thorny vegetation to form war fences. Later, people would tether domestic animals around their villages to provide natural fire breaks to halt the otherwise devastating dry season fires that would sweep through. And then later by encouraging cola and then cocoa trees to grow in the understory, a form of cocoa agroforestry, which is now often promoted, but is actually a long-standing practice. And again, these forest islands both embody these overlapping historical legacies, but also a world which is much more connected. It's more than human. And walking through these forest islands with our companions, people would point out the places that were jinna homes, the houses of spirits. They would point out the particular rocks or trees where ancestors used to be. They would also point out places of practical encounter. But there are places too of much more intimate, more than human relations between generations of people and plants and animals, imbued with quite convivial relations amongst cohabitants. And that's a different view of forests from one that's simply about livelihoods or ecosystem services that you can count and perhaps economize or financialize as values. So those are some West African stories. Let's shift a little bit now into a couple of other places. So moving into North America, here I've been very inspired in recent years by the accounts of Robin Kimmerer, who is both a biologist of some repute, but also a member of the Potawatomi Nation. And the stories that she provides and relates are also striking accounts of what I've come to term forest lifeways, revealing again these dynamics of more than human worlds over time. So Robin Kimmerer, for example, tells of the pecan groves that thread their way along river courses and through the prairies of parts of the American Midwest, and where those pecan trees all fruit together at unpredictable intervals every few years, a kind of boom and bust cycle, which is termed mass fruiting, and in which both people and animals, including squirrels, kind of align in a sort of feast and famine kind of harvesting practice. And forest ecologists have attended to interpret this synchrony through a predator-prey hypothesis, a kind of dynamic between trees and squirrels and their predators, a sort of fairly mechanical, plausible, but quite mechanical view of the interactions that take place. And we might therefore envisage people's livelihoods and their harvesting and ability to, as a way of kind of hitching on to this ecological ecosystem dynamic. But Robin Kimmerer does something slightly different. She finds that explanation wanting. And she turns instead to a relational explanation for that mass fruiting practice that actually aligns with Potawatomi's own theorizing. And she turns to some of the new biology of fungal networks, which redistribute carbohydrates from tree to tree, and looks at the way that many Potawatomi interpret that as a reciprocity of a sort of mode of giving and taking that also aligns with human values and the ways people understand their relations with a more than human world, which is of mutual dependence and reciprocity and gift. And it's that reciprocity that is seen to enable that mutual flourishing, in which, as Kimmerer puts it, soil, fungus, tree, squirrel, child, all are the beneficiaries of reciprocity. Notably as well, amongst this group, as amongst some other American First Nations people, ways of being also envisage forest trees as kin, even persons. And so part of the guiding, as if you like, the governance of this reciprocity also comes from a council of the pecans, as it's envisaged, where the trees themselves are part of a process of governance that ensures that those reciprocal relations that ensure mutual thriving are upheld. Again, though, these more than human forests, as I suggest they are, archive human history. And here, the history is one of enormous violence because these pecan groves occupy a landscape in which First Nations peoples have experienced appalling subjugation and violence. And over the past century, of course, there's been enforced movement of human populations onto reservations and into individualized forms of land tenure, which forcibly disrupted many of these entanglements between people and land's non-human inhabitants. A heritage documented very strongly in museums like this, but also one that is lived every day. And it's interesting that the remaining pecan groves that are still standing are understood by Kimmerer and the people she works with as offering forms of reciprocity and mutuality that have been lost in many other areas of life. And it's therefore not surprising that there's a synchrony between the Potawatomi family reunion festivals and the mass fruiting of the pecan groves. That's important materially to feed the crowds that gather, but it's also important as an embodiment, as a connection symbolically and in terms of sort of conceptions and understandings of ways of being, because it's that kind of reciprocity amongst people and the reciprocity amongst people and nature that is again celebrated and reenacted anew in these gatherings. So this is North America. But I now want to suggest that one really doesn't need to travel far. And I mean, there are those of us in this room who have been brought up in some of the parts of the world I've been talking about. There are others of us who've been born and brought up in other parts of the world. None of us, though, need to travel far to so-called other places to find these kind of convivial, more than human lifeways in forests. They're here in Europe too. I would argue that they're here also amongst industrial urbanites, although they're often obscured and sometimes delegitimized by formal science and education. So let's just take, just briefly, Southeast UK, which is where I live, just a bit south of Oxford. I spend a lot of my time in Sussex and a lot of my time in Cambridge. And here, the historical ecologies of woodlands and forests have been the focus of monumental works by people like Oliver Rackham and his generations of students, who in places like Hayley Woods and other forests in Southeast England have again absolutely debunked narratives of one-way disturbance of forests as something pristine until suddenly they're kind of encroached upon by contemporary generations. And Rackham and his students show again how all forests embody and encode these layered legacies of past management practices and how those are still there to be seen in current woodland composition, whether it's the way trees have grown, whether it's the quality of biodiversity, whether it's the forms reflecting ancient coppicing practices, or whether it's the cultural artifacts and archaeological remains that one finds in forests. And the moves that we now see towards protecting woodlands and forests in the UK, in national parks, in nature reserves, or indeed in restoring landscapes, encouraging rewilding and tree regeneration, as everywhere, lock into and build on these layered legacies, whether in soil conditions, whether in tenurial conditions, whether in the quality of the vegetation that's there. And the resulting forests too, perhaps we ought to think about how they may be experienced in more than human relational ways. So to get even more personal here, a few years ago, my family and I started to plant trees on some old pasture in our small holding in the foothills of the South Downs, an area that was, again, once covered with yew forests and then has been subjected to many generations of intensive sheep grazing. And here in a field in the foothills, we started to plant a few kind of species that would have been part of those earlier forests. And over time, the oak, the hawthorn, the beech, the hazel, the other saplings have grown. The undergrowth gradually has begun to thicken. It's had to do battle with rabbits, with badgers, with soil conditions that were the result of earlier grazing. But gradually, numerous birds, insects have become regular visitors. It's becoming a woodland. It's gradually becoming a forest, although it's not a very thick one yet. But the point is that we find that we're observing and wandering and sitting amongst all of this, not just with scientific detachment, nor with that kind of objective, right, we've got to plant these trees and encourage them to grow as things, as objects, or as features in a landscape, but also with pleasure, with emotional entanglement, with a kind of affect and connection that feels much more like being in a community of kin, a community that we find ourselves nurturing and caring for and worrying about. It's too dry, we've got to take some water and give little cups of water to these trees, which is a bit tricky in this landscape because the nearest water source is right at the bottom of a hill. We weed around these trees, and we find we're caring about them a little bit as if they were kin. It's like a widening of a circle of acquaintances, and it's been quite interesting to reflect on that. And it's made me think also further about what is going on when, in the southeast of England, as in many places, people who don't live in forests, visit them as less familiar places, and yet seek to satisfy some desire for connection, either in forests in urban places on the edge of them. What people are led to believe when they respond to advertisements to do forest bathing, as here, or perhaps where they seek to walk in a forest as a way of kind of breaking the routine of daily life. Often we talk about the seeking of connection through immersion somehow. But what is connection? It's not just about being in a place. It's also perhaps about being in something that is a more than human community. It's one that's lively, it's one that's relational. It's one where there may also be a sense of connection with historical legacies, with perhaps the people and the other aspects of landscape interaction that went before. And perhaps this is part of what makes us feel good or refreshed or challenged or out of our comfort zone, or the many kinds of things one feels when on a walk or sitting in a forest. But the point is, whatever the precise emotion, and people are going to feel things in very different ways, there is emotion. And again, this is far more than livelihoods. So these are all stories then that in different ways illustrate what I'm terming forest lifeways. So what are the implications, and what might this lead one to think about as we all grapple with perhaps justice and equity questions and inclusion questions in nature restoration, conservation, and particularly with a forest lens? So there are three, and what I want to spell out is three sets of implications for conservation justice. And the first, I think, comes from this question of histories and layered legacies. So from war to epidemics to climate change to economic shocks, events are shaping people's interactions with forest assemblages, and how they respond sets the stage for what happens afterwards. And external interventions interlock with those histories. So a place like Gola, that I started with, becomes a kind of archive of farming and the slave trade, of colonial wars, of timber exploitation, of the cacao economy, of civil war, of epidemics, as well as a history of reservation and now conservation for biodiversity and carbon as well. And each leaves its mark on vegetation quality, but also on social memories, on heritage, on claims to tenure, to control, to governance. And I wonder if we shouldn't be doing more to recognize those, and perhaps to think about them as part of restorative justice, and as approaches to equity and justice, which are partly reparative and are about repairing and compensating for historical injustices as those connectivities were ripped apart through past interventions. So that's the first. The second turns to ways of being, or what one might like to call ontologies, if one's being social sciencey about it. So what I've suggested is that forests and forest assemblages are often experienced as emplaced more than human communities of many kinds of beings, and that people co-inhabit with them in a kind of nature kind of which they're all part. And these relations are not just socioeconomic, they're not just delivering livelihood benefits, ecosystem services, provisioning benefits, economic values, framings that are easily compatible with capitalist conservation, with notions of natural capital, with systems that might create units of accounting of carbon, of biodiversity, and then seek to trade or compensate for them in new carbon schemes. Rather, thriving and well-being depend more broadly on a kind of ordering of a set of lived values of kind of kin in a more than human community. And I would suggest that appreciating this kind of such ways of being, which are going to vary enormously, they're as diverse as places and cultures are, but there's a commonality to that sense of more than humanness. And perhaps we ought to be seeking to understand and engage with those and resurface them in more respectful and in more appreciative ways. And that perhaps suggests the need for more kinds of justice, one you might call ontological justice amongst different ways of being, and perhaps multi-species justice that recognizes the subject of justice as more than human, not just people, but actually more than human multi-species communities. And I think that opens up some opportunities to engage with legal frameworks too, around rights of nature and earth jurisprudence. And we could come back to some of that in discussion. I think they're really interesting routes into ways of thinking about forest governance. And then the final edition is around ways of knowing, so that the whole domain of knowledge and evidence and whose knowledge counts. So I've suggested that sort of getting rid of this assumption, these storylines that people only or inevitably disturb or degrade natural forest, opens up possibilities to identify and build on local practices of enrichment, of regeneration, of restoration, positive practices and experiences, which is absolutely not to say that people don't sometimes get involved in degrading forests. They will be pressurized to do so for all kinds of reasons. But we're often blinkered from appreciating the restorative and the regenerative by the assumptions that people only do damage and that forest change is only one way. This is much more than indigenous knowledge seen as something technical or applied intentionally. It also encompasses ways of knowing that are social, they're cultural, they're historical, they're embedded in experience. And that means that we need methods that can pick up on those things. Socioeconomic surveys, participatory livelihood mapping are all helpful, but they only go so far. I think we might also need to triangulate those with evidence that's ethnographic, and perhaps also with arts-based methods, things like digital storytelling, or even musical forms that enable the relating of stories in culturally meaningful ways. And such ways of knowing and their concepts may well end up diverging from post-Enlightenment sciences, but I think there's still room for accommodation in what Francis Nyanjo, to quote him again, would see as a convivial scholarship approach, which is an alternative to colonial science or to turning to indigenous knowledge, says we need to bring these multiple perspectives into the same space and search for a kind of hybridity, which doesn't seek to reduce them to being the same thing, to integrate them, but which actually opens up an equitable debate around different ways of knowing, something that we might call epistemic justice. So finally then, my last slide suggests then that, going back to that idea of lifeways and these forms of equity, we might add to those notions of justice. We need to perhaps to deepen recognitional justice beyond what it often comes to be, which is a kind of stakeholderism, just saying which stakeholders are present in a given forum, really to focus in on ontological justice amongst ways of being and epistemic justice among different ways of knowing. And I think we also need to open up our distributional justice to think about the past and about the restorative. And in the middle, if we're thinking about equity of what and between whom, to bring in the multi-species justice and the kinds of rights-based frameworks that might recognize and respect those. And this all foregrounds power in all its manifestations, both the material power and political economy, and sometimes sheer violence, which has often been enwrapped with certain lifeways and the suppression of them, as well as the discursive power that allows certain stories, certain narratives to prevail over others, including the discursive power that these days so often enables narrow, mechanistic, economistic ways of valuing and thinking about nature and forests in particular, in my case, to obscure those stories that tell of lifeways and their more kin-like, more than human connectivities that are so important, arguably, I would say, to the way we live into the future. So fostering and safeguarding, I think, hopeful and caring futures for forests and their more than human life couldn't be more important at this point. And among the crises we're in, I think this is really urgent. But urgency shouldn't, I think, be an excuse to gloss over the issues and the perspectives that actually might be important to the people who live with forests, and issues that include livelihoods and governance, but that also go beyond those, requiring a bit more attention to lifeways, to justice and to power. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that. We can open up to questions now. So does anybody want to kick off questions? Well, okay, great. Go on there.
Nice.
Hi, thank you very much. That was really fantastic to listen to. Well, this is loud. I had a question about kind of these organizations. I think you're suggesting that they incorporate kind of more of what you're saying into their practices, but how can you actually reconcile with acknowledging or achieving like epistemic justice when you were there, say as Flora and Fauna, as an organization funded by a Global North Agenda and money from that. Is that actually ever possible, or are we continuing doing the same thing we've always done, just like adding little bits of kind of sugaring to the same practice?
Yeah. I mean, that is such a great question, and it's the question that I'm now grappling with every day. So I'm now working with 10 organizations who, like Fauna and Flora, are trying to do really practical things on the ground and are doing the right thing, but are absolutely dependent on global North agendas and the funding that flows from it. So of course, in that context, one reaction, and it has been a reaction when I first arrived at CCI and talked with their Liberia group about the work that I'd done in Ziama, which is one of their focal areas. The first reaction from the project managers was, well, if you say things like that, if we expose that actually these forests haven't always been there, then that's going to be a license to let in the loggers and to allow for forest destruction and to undo all the conservation work we've been doing. So I went, okay, so then we backtracked a bit, and actually the Liberian lead, who is from Liberia, she had a slightly different view on this, and she said, look, actually, if we want to think seriously about forest governance, we need to appreciate histories. We need to understand what the perspectives and values are of the people who at the local level are becoming involved in governance. And she got very, very interested. So now we're opening up ways to try and bring a kind of deeper understanding of history and lifeways into the way that forest conservation practices are unfolding. And we've got a bigger West African initiative called Wanti, which is working across the Upper Guinean forest zone and is trying to challenge some of those kind of established frameworks and build from below much more fully. But it is very, I mean, it's very tricky, and I think the finance. So I think organizations are absolutely prepared to move and know they must move towards, as it were, incorporating a community engagement and including local communities. But still, the reflex way of doing that is alternative livelihoods. And if we can just get people out of these forests or give them something else to do. And that's a very, very limited way to think about inclusion. So it's a big work in progress. And I think the financialization of forests and indeed biodiversity more generally, through carbon schemes, through biodiversity crediting, is fundamentally pushing in the wrong direction, because it's foregrounding these quite narrow economic values and encouraging thinking which, as if we could measure and treat these entangled relationships as transactions in units of biodiversity and units of carbon, which I think ultimately will drive separations further. So it's a bit of a fraught field, actually, and could go in different ways.
Thank you, Melissa. That was a beautiful talk. I really very much enjoyed it. I was doing those biodiversity surveys in Sierra Leone in 1989 with others, so we may have been there at the same time.
No, seriously.
Yeah.
Okay.
But what I wanted to ask was where you see rights and rights-based conservation fitting into all this. We've had some discussions, some of us here recently, about how to talk about rights. There's obviously the big international discourse now about rights-based conservation, but how that fits in countries like Ghana or Sierra Leone, to some extent Liberia. Liberia is better actually in government recognition of rights, but how to deal with rights issues and incorporate it into these sort of outcomes-based arguments that you've been talking about as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, great question, and something we're doing a lot of work on through the organizations at CCI. We've kicked off a big discussion which is being led by some of the partners, including in Fauna and Flora and UNEP WCMC, around rights-based approaches. And it's also connecting up with bigger discussions across the university. And I've also been part of a very interesting group of both government and social movement activists trying to develop a set of inclusive principles for biodiversity action, which you may know about. And we had a big dialogue at Wilton Park, and then took some of those ideas to COP16, and then had a follow-up meeting at CCI. And that's very high level, but it's making a set of statements about how to be inclusive, which could be helpful to donors and programmers. But I think going back at one level, I think going back to rights-based approaches is a really important counter to market-based approaches. And they're not wholly incompatible, but they're quite incompatible. And it does remind me, I mean, I've been in the international development world for a really long time, and there was a period in the early 2000s where rights-based development was all the rage, and then rights-based development was dropped, and suddenly development was all about market instruments. And I think and I think the same happened in conservation. I think the return to rights-based conservation is really important. I think a couple of things. I think it's rights are always layered. And so in somewhere like Liberia or Ghana or Sierra Leone, or indeed anywhere, you have to ask rights, whose rights and rights to what, and to look at the different kinds of layered, multiple leveled institutions that are upholding those rights legally and so on. I think rights are always and only as good as how far they become real. So rights in law or rights in policy or rights in a framework aren't any good if people can't actually claim those rights and benefit from them. So there's a sort of rights in practice kind of set of arguments which are really important, and this is where power comes into play. And I mean, the other area that I think we've also now got a kind of interesting interaction between human rights, and now the Universal Declaration on Human Rights includes the right to a clean and healthy environment, which I think could be quite valuable to conservation. But in order to realize that, I think some of the most interesting work is actually coming out of earth jurisprudence and rights to nature, which is not about does nature have rights or do people have rights, which is often the way it's seen. These are not pitted against each other, but it's actually to say that often by granting rights to rivers or to forests, we've actually got a better unit and framework through which we can then see how the human rights to a clean and healthy environment can be realized. And so I think some of the most exciting work in this area is coming. Well, it takes its inspiration from Bolivia and Ecuador and Pachamama having rights, as well as New Zealand or Australia, where rocks and rivers have rights. But actually, there are examples in the UK too. I mean, the River Cam and the River Ouse, which flows through the town where I live, are all subjects now for rights of nature. And it's a kind of framework which is bringing the diverse elements that make up that environment and its connectivities with people then as a subject of justice and rights. So I think there's a lot going on in this area, and it's really critical.
Thank you very much. Looking at governance, natural resource governance, as the man in Ziama or which communities that indicated that they need to be involved and then they'll be able to take care of natural resources. But then I found it difficult justifying this. If you look at the way resources that are 100% in the control of communities have been degraded more recently. If you look at the developing communities where we have maybe totally protected areas, you have maybe regulated reserves and that of community-owned areas, you realize that the degradation is massive in the community-managed areas and growing up towards the Yeah. So I was just wondering, how do we justify this? Could it be that maybe there is some kind of generational differences in the way our forefathers were thinking compared to we, the current generation?
So, sorry, just to get that clear, you're saying the areas, you know, the community managed areas are in a better state or a worse state? Worse state
Yes.
than the protected areas.
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, I think one then has to ask, why is that? What are the drivers that are making it difficult for people to look after and maintain those areas? And it might be economic pressures, it might be political pressures, it might be governance issues to do with how far people can retain control over the trees and the land that they're on, and avoid having to let in outsiders. It might be because people don't actually have livelihood choices, and they're then having to trade off those sorts of connections. It also might be about who is in control of decisions in those places. I think one always has to look at what the extant institutions are, and consider whether perhaps there are local institutions that could be more important in stewarding those areas than are actually recognized. I mean, there's often a tendency for community management to go through the kind of local authority at an official level. I mean, it's often in places where I've worked, it's sometimes the paramount chief, or it's sometimes a customary authority. That's actually not probably the matrix of perhaps less formal institutions that is actually important to governing and managing people's relations with nature. And there you'd need to look to women's organizations, to youth groups, to informal relations, perhaps between particular families and landowners and strangers. So there's a whole matrix of informal institutions which perhaps have greater roles to play in stewardship.
By the way, I was referring to kind of open access scenarios, not those instances where we have kind of structured community-based management initiatives.
Okay,
I
okay.
was referring to open access scenario. For instance, we have this Galamsey issue in Ghana that community, it's just a mess more.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, as the wonderful Eleanor Ostrom's work has so often shown us, what we imagine to be open access are often common property management arrangements. And so perhaps one should look to what institutions are still there and what is the potential for some of those that could be stewarding those resources, which now seem to be a free-for-all. There are perhaps less obvious, perhaps slightly hidden institutional arrangements and norms that could play a greater role if they were recognized and supported in restoration and recovery and repair. I don't know, it's a question. It's a question for exploration, place by place, really. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I was very struck by the parallels between your use of the term Lifeways and actually how the Welsh cultural theorist Raymond Williams used livelihood when he was writing in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And he used it as a kind of alternative to production.
Yeah.
And used it as a term to capture the idea of a whole way of life, including emotional, historical, ecological connections. So, and indeed, the resonances between your kind of analysis and, say, The Country and the City, which you wrote in the early 70s. And of course, he was writing about Britain, and just a further quick comment, really, what you were saying really made me think of an area I know well, County Durham, where there's quite a movement now to renovate the miners' banners that they used to march with, involving women, young people, and not just men. And that heritage is really important. But on one of those miners' lodge banners is a picture of a Roman soldier standing next to a miner, because Roman Britain was part of the life world
Yes.
of the pit villages
Yeah.
because they had the ruin, the
Yeah.
land of Hadrian's Wall. So that continuity, but those communities renovating those banners now, they're in a county that doesn't really have an economic base anymore that can certainly sustain a population without sort of public spending.
Yeah.
So the economic sense of livelihood remains very important.
Yeah. No, that's such a great example and a really interesting one. And of course, I think the term, I mean, like all terms, there are many ways of using and interpreting them. And thank you for reminding of that earlier version of livelihood, which was, I think, absolutely, as you say, more expansive, more cultural, more about ways of life than about the narrow economic. And I think it was that when it became, I mean, when livelihood suddenly became sort of fashionable again in development and sort of in the work that colleagues and I were involved in at IDS, and we were very explicitly saying livelihoods are a combination of people are sort of putting together the social and the natural and the economic and so on to provide something that is a whole, that is a way of life which is enabling people to sustain. And we talked about sustainable livelihoods. It's interesting, even at that time, the term capitals was used, which was alluding then to social capital and social capital theory, which is about social networks. And of course, cultural capital was the term used by Bourdieu and others. And so you can use capital in that context. Now, I think what we've seen happening is maybe in our neoliberal times, a narrowing of both livelihood to be much more about the economic and the short term. And certainly that's the way it tends to be used in the conservation world, at least as I'm sort of seeing it now. And also a narrowing of the use of the term capital to be, as it were, capitalism, and to be often that which you can commoditize and financialize, which of course that's not the original use of capital. Capital can also be about social status and cultural status. So it's interesting. I mean, I agree with you basically, and I think my critique of livelihoods and suggestion that something like Lifeways, which is not a deeply theorized concept, I have to say. It's a shorthand for trying to bring in some wider concerns, is a response to a kind of contemporary, rather narrow way that I'm seeing livelihood being used in quite a lot of environmental and practical conservation work. Yeah.
One more time.
Thank you very much. Well, it was an incredibly inspiring talk. I spend a lot of time in Guinea, but I work for a development charity in Conakry, which, as you know, is enormously urbanized and growing. The debate there is all about economic development, but in their view, it would be about exploiting their mineral resources, reducing their energy dependence, and in particular, reducing their dependency on imported foods. And the government would argue very strongly that they are trying to empower the Guinean population as a whole by taking greater ownership of that, being part of aluminium smelting rather than just shipping that off to Dubai. I strongly urge that there must be some interaction between what you're saying and what they're doing, because there's a danger they could cause a catastrophe. But actually, I'm sure there are many people, in fact, I'm certain of many people who would really be willing to engage with you.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And of course, these areas are right on the edge of the Pic de Fond, the big iron ore mountains, which after decades of faffing around, frankly, are now actually going to be exploited. And the railway to Conakry from the forest zone is going to be built, and exploitation will begin. And as an anthropologist working in that area and our local colleagues, we were constantly brought in earlier phases of that Rio Tinto scheme, as it then was, to try and provide how do you involve local communities so they won't resist this mining development, or kind of analysis. And then of course at the time of Ebola, there was a lot of attribution of that whole epidemic, local communities assumed that the Ebola outbreak was being spread by those who wanted to develop those iron ore mines and the railway and displace local populations. And essentially it was a genocide to remove local inhabitants so that then they could have the land for mining. So this is a really contentious area. I think, and I mean, it does rub straight up against the kind of thing that I've been talking about. I think for the government, there's a certain short-sightedness in rapid scale economic development based on destructive mining and large scale soil mining, commercial agriculture, which is not going to be resilient. It's going to boost your economy for a bit, and then is going to leave the country in a mess.
I think there's a more positive perspective. What you're saying actually is a very powerful message around the empowerment.
Well, exactly.
When allowed to do things in the local community's own way. You know, we're sometimes accused in the UK of having a sort of view of exceptionism. I mean, places like Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, which have been through very, very hard times, there's almost the opposite. And a positive story would have a very powerful impact on people.
Exactly. So I think the positives, I mean, there are big positive stories here about food and agriculture, and I mean not just in the forest zone, but some of the debates I'm part of in IPES Food are really showing how agroecology, those principles around regenerative farming and agriculture that works with nature, is in the long run going to be more equitable, more sustainable, more resilient to climate change, as well as reducing dependence on fossil fuels, which is going to be an impossible thing to sustain into the future. And actually the fact that in places like Guinea, or actually indeed in the UK, you've got local regenerative practices which you can build on to do that. And there's also, I think, a really positive story about, I mean, that elder in Isabella more or less said it all: give us control and we'll look after it. And I think there's a really strong argument actually about funding forests, where you say this is an asset that a nation needs, maybe the globe needs to mitigate climate change. Pay the people who are there to look after it what it's now worth to the globe. And it's a different economic argument. It's not about let's have accounting schemes around credit and so on, but it's actually about recognizing ownership, recognizing control, and empowering those who are in a position to look after. Okay. Well, great.
We're having drinks around the corner, so feel free to linger for informal conversation. You're all very welcome.
Yeah.
And thank you very, very much, Melissa, for a really wide-ranging and fascinating set of concepts and ideas. Thank you very much.
Yeah, lovely. Okay.